Okay, today I want to talk about sort of a pet peeve of mine. Every so often I'll go on the internet and I don't really look at these forums or these groups related to bodybuilding because they tend to be habituated by moronic trolls who leave nasty messages without having the guts or the balls to use their real name. These people are the scumbags of the world that should be ignored. I don't even like looking at their messages. But anyway, sometimes I will actually, I might be looking for something else. I might look into one of those groups. Every so often I see messages concerning the bodybuilders of yesteryear. When I say yesteryear, I don't mean in Arnold's era in the 70s or even the 60s. I'm talking about the 50s, 40s, and earlier. Now, what the part that bothers me about some of these messages is some of these guys who are probably not even 25 years old, little punks who have no idea of the history of bodybuilding. They look at photos of these guys from, let's say, the 40s or the 50s, and they see the size of some of these guys, and they accuse them of using anabolic steroids. Some of them are so dumb they even mention growth hormone, which wasn't even around back then. They're just absolute idiots. And why do they do it? In other words, why do they look at these guys, let's say from the 40s and the 70s? And some of these guys were pretty big. But I'll explain why it's unlikely they took any drugs. But first I want to talk about the motivation of people who criticize them. The people that criticize them are little punks that have never been able to add any size. They have no favorable genetics towards bodybuilding. They train and train and train. They might even take anabolic drugs themselves, yet they get no results. So they look at a guy like Steve Reeves or Reg Park or some of these old-time bodybuilders, and they see the size of these guys who look 1,000 times better than they are. And these little punks get jealous and they say, well, they got that way because they use steroids. They know nothing about these guys. They know nothing about the way they train, but they have to. They just accuse them of using anabolic steroids out of nowhere with no evidence whatsoever. Now let's talk about the reasons why these old-time bodybuilders are very unlikely to have used steroids. I'll mention a couple, and I can't talk about all of them. But first of all, let me explain that testosterone itself was first synthesized by German scientists in 1935. The first oral steroid, methyltestosterone, was actually synthesized or produced a year earlier in 1934. So theoretically, you can say, well, since steroids were produced in the mid-30s, why didn't bodybuilders of the 40s and 50s use them? There's a number of reasons. First of all, the steroids were not widely available. They were rarely used. And for a time in the early 40s, testosterone was often prescribed for men who had depression. Testosterone was thought to ease depression in the early 40s. And for a short time, it was actually prescribed by some doctors to men who suffered from severe depression. The bodybuilders tend to not be depressed. So to their minds, they thought, why use this testosterone? The full anabolic properties of testosterone, this is an important point. The full, complete anabolic properties, in other words, the parts of the drug that produce muscle size and strength gains, weren't readily known in those days. Testosterone was just thought as a therapeutic aid for the mind more than anything else. So the bodybuilders would not touch testosterone. And the second thing is you have to consider how these bodybuilders train. They train year-round. They train much heavier. They use basic exercises. I happen to know Reg Park very well. He became a good friend of mine in his last couple of years. And we used to talk about how he trained many times. And Reg Park was amazingly strong. He took no drugs, yet was one of the first bodybuilders to bench press 500 pounds. He had a number of humongous lifts, several of them set world records. And Reg Park was adamantly opposed to steroids. He told me that he didn't even like going to his I guess you could say his pupil, if you want to call it that, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Reg would often go to Arnold's show, the Arnold contest in Columbus. But Reg confided to me that while he enjoyed seeing Arnold and the fans and his old friends, he hated to actually look at the bodybuilding contest because of what he called the bloated look of current bodybuilders. He thought these physiques were very ugly, the way the stomach stood out. He thought it was disgusting. And the man was adamantly against steroids. And you could tell when somebody's lying. He was not lying. And if you look at his progress, like I did, from the time he began training in the let's say early 40s to his successive, I think it was 4 Miss Universe victories. He just improved in quality with each passing year, and that was from his dedication to hard training. Another example, another guy who's frequently accused of using steroids, Steve Reeves. Some of you younger guys might not remember Steve Reeves. Steve Reeves was the 1947 Mr. America, and he won the NABA Miss Universe, defeating Reg Park in 1950 in London. Now, Steve Reeves gained a lot of fame when he filmed the film Hercules in Italy in 1957. Hercules was officially released in 1959 and immediately became a box office hit, and Steve Reeves became a household name. He became world famous. He went on to do a number of other movies besides that. Now, Steve Reeves did not use steroids. Like Reg Park, he was adamantly opposed to steroids. He publicly talked about how much he was against steroids. And to show how genetic Steve Reeves was, if you can look at the Hercules film on YouTube, I believe you can look at it, and you can look at Steve Reeves in that film. He was considerably smaller than he was when he was a bodybuilder. He was maybe 190 pounds in the Hercules movies. But the truth of the matter is he still definitely had a definite physique. And Steve Reeves himself said that when he was filming Hercules, he only trained 1 month out of the year. Let me repeat that, 1 month out of the year. That's what you call bodybuilding genetics. Almost anybody who doesn't have exceptional bodybuilding genetics would look like absolute pile of crap if they trained once a year and laid off the rest of the year. Steve Reeves, his genetics was so superior that he was able to get away with it. Steve Reeves didn't need to use steroids. Now, with these guys, I'll mention one other guy, John C. Grimmick. John C. Grimmick was he was actually the idol of all these guys. Steve Reeves, Reg Park, they all looked up to him. He was like the dean of bodybuilders. He was the only man to win the Mr. America contest twice, in 1940 and 1941. After that, the Amateur Athletic Union, which put on the contest, passed a rule preventing any man from winning the Mr. America more than once because of the fear that John Grimmick was so dominant among compared to the other competitors that he would win year after year. Now, John Grimmick is, of these, let's say, past bodybuilders, was one of the few that actually admitted to using anabolic steroids. Now, how this came about was due to a physician named John Ziegler, who was a Maryland physician who went to Russia in the mid-1950s and conversed with the Russian weightlifting team and coaches, and he found out the Russians were giving their weightlifters testosterone. And nobody had ever heard of using testosterone in athletic competition before that. This kind of put an idea in Dr. Ziegler's mind. When he came back to the United States in the late 50s, he collaborated with the Ciba Pharmaceutical Company to develop an oral anabolic steroid, which was called methandrostenolone with the trade name Dianabol. Dianabol became one of the most popular and famous steroids. Now, what Ziegler did is he supplied an early prototype of Dianabol. He supplied it to the York Barbell weightlifting team in York, Pennsylvania. And sure enough, 3 of the Olympic weightlifters, shortly after getting on the Dianabol regime, they set personal and world records in weightlifting. So Ziegler realized he was onto something, but very little was known about anabolic steroids. And Ziegler insisted that the weightlifters only take the standard recommended dose, which was only 2 tablets or 10 milligrams. However, these weightlifters got so enthusiastic about all the strength they were gaining from using the Dianabol, although a lot of it probably was a placebo effect. But in any case, they started doubling and tripling the dose, and Ziegler got disgusted, and he kind of washed his hands on steroids. And for the rest of his life, he became an anti-steroid crusader. He went the opposite direction. However, during this early time, John Grimmick was working at the York Barbell Company. And, John Grimmick was retired for many years, but he was still working out pretty hard. And John Grimmick himself was a exceptional weightlifter who actually made the Olympic team to go to Germany in 1936. I'm not sure if he actually went or not. That I don't know. But I know that he was an exceptional athlete himself. and he decided, because Ziegler said that taking 2 tablets of Dianabol seemed to be safe, Grimmick decided to try it. So he took 2 tablets of Dianabol. I think he took it for about 2-3 months. I don't remember exactly how long, but Grimmick deduced that taking the 2 tablets of Dianabol did absolutely nothing for him. It didn't increase his muscle size, it didn't increase his strength, and he wrote off anabolic steroids as being useless. Of course, today we know that taking 2 tablets of 10 milligrams of Dianabol is like a child's dose. It's not going to really do anything for somebody who's seeking larger muscles. But the truth of the matter is that, to get to the point of this video, the notion that bodybuilders of the 40s, 50s, I remember talking to Clarence Ross a month before he died. Clarence Ross actually defeated Steve Reeves twice in bodybuilding competition. He was a Mr. America 1945, considered one of the great bodybuilders of the 40s and 50s. And he told me, when I asked him if you could do anything over again, to change anything that you did before, he told me that he wouldn't have trained as heavy as he did for as long as he did, because he had aches and pains all over his body and could barely walk. He had to use a walker to walk. Now, the reason he got that way was consistent use of very heavy weights all the way into his 40s, 50s, and later. And this caused him to have injuries that more or less crippled him when he became an older man. Now, he never took steroids. None of these guys took steroids. And, for somebody to accuse the bodybuilders of the 40s and 50s, like Reg Park, Steve Reeves, Clarence Ross, John Grimmick, to accuse them of using steroids without evidence, just by the way they look, makes you a low-down scumbag, because you have no evidence to prove it. You're making accusations at men without a drop of evidence, and you're overlooking the fact that these men were genetic freaks. To say that the men or the bodybuilding champions of the 40s and 50s use anabolic steroids is tantamount to saying that if you take away it's tantamount to saying that anybody can look like Phil Heath, the current Mr. Olympia, if you use his steroid program, which is absurd and ridiculous. But it's the same level of thinking. So my advice to you is, if you encounter any of these nasty, stupid messages where these people are accusing men like Reg Park and Steve Reeves of using steroids, just laugh it off, because they're stupid statements. Trust me, I know it. I don't doubt this for a second. And any of you, if you want, by the way, the best information on nutrition, exercise science, hormonal therapy, fat loss research, anti-aging therapies, ergogenic aids, subscribe today to my Applied Metabolics newsletter, www.appliedmetabolics.com. The best information you will find anywhere on the web. Better than any magazine, better than any website, better than any so-called science blog. I cover stuff that isn't available elsewhere, and I also include my over 50 years of empirical experience. And by the way, some people have criticized me because I mentioned my newsletter in these videos, but let me point out, I'll just say this once. The reason I do these videos is to promote my newsletter. If I didn't publish this newsletter, I would not be doing these videos. I don't get off just spouting out information. I'm not particularly interested in seeing myself in videos, and I'm not trying to be a YouTube star. So can those stupid comments complaining about how I always mention my Applied Metabolics newsletter, because in a way, Applied Metabolics is sponsoring these videos. Without it, there would be no videos. And if I ever stop publishing Applied Metabolics, there will be no videos. I guarantee it. Have a good day.